Hi, I'm Dr. Jonny Bowden. I'm a board-certified nutritionist, and I'm also known as the Nutrition Mythbuster. And today, my job is to bust some myths about palm oil. And I'm going to speak specifically about the nutritional myths about palm oil, which are hard to talk about without talking about fat in general and the bad rap fat has gotten for the last 40 years, and particularly the bad rap saturated fat has gotten for the last 40 years or so. You can see that in these kinds of advisory things where they say you can see palm oil right there in that list of foods that contain saturated fats and that you should eat less of. It doesn't belong on that list. I'm going to show you why. I spend a lot of my time going on television talking about nutritional myths, and I talk about palm oil a lot, as you can see from these pictures. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, if palm oil is a saturated fat, and let's face it, 50% of palm oil is saturated fat, I don't think that should be a problem at all, and I don't think you will either when you finish hearing my presentation, but let's just say that people are concerned about that. One of the things that they're worried about is that that saturated fat in palm oil is going to cause them heart disease. And this is part of a whole mythology around fat that was actually chronicled in a wonderful movie which is available on Amazon, and I recommend very highly. It's called Fat Fiction. Don't count it against the movie that I'm in it. It really has a lot of experts kind of blowing apart these myths about how we should limit our fat, eat more high carb diets, and all the rest of the stuff that really constitutes the mythology of fat that we're going to be talking about today. So, what are some of the fictions when it comes to fat? Well, number one, eating fat makes you fat. Every one of you who's ever tried to lose weight has heard that from somebody, from a doctor, from a magazine. If you eat fat, you're going to get fat. Well, that's not true, and we'll see why in a minute. Saturated fat clogs your arteries. That's one of the biggies. That's one that is just about every major health organization in the world believes this. It's not true. A third one is that it's healthy to substitute vegetable oils for saturated fat. Also not true, and if you stick around to the end, which I hope you will, I'm going to tell you a very entertaining and actually heartwarming story about the one and only time this hypothesis was actually tested. Number four, there's good fat and bad fat, but what that breaks down to is basically that the good fat is unsaturated and bad fat is saturated. A variation of this is that animal fats are bad and non-animal fats are good. They're both very, very far from the whole truth, and the truth is really very much more nuanced. You'll see that also as we go through. And then I highlighted this one in red because it's a particular issue for me, something that I really have spent a lot of my career trying to correct the bad information about this. Saturated fat raises cholesterol, and why are we afraid of that, folks? Altogether, because we all know that cholesterol causes heart disease. Actually, I wrote a book about this, and I think the best way to explain why that particular myth, let's go back to it, saturated fat raises cholesterol, which causes heart disease, the best way to understand why that is problematic is to think about emissions testing on your car. Everybody can relate to that. In California, we have very strict smog tests. We have regulations all across the country on smog testing. And if you don't pass a smog test, if your emissions test shows a negative output, there's a lot of stuff you have to do. It is not easy. You have to comply with all these regulations, and you have to have all these things done to the car, and you have to have it corrected, and you have to show the paperwork. Well, suppose it suddenly became apparent that the machines that they use to test the smog, to test the emissions, are defective. That the machines were calibrated in 1960 and they haven't been changed since, and they're giving incorrect readings. And all these people are either having their cars fixed or thinking their cars are fine based on a reading of a machine that doesn't work. Well, that's what's happening with the cholesterol test. I don't want to go too far afield. I wrote a book about that. But the notion that we should avoid saturated fat because it raises a number on a test that's obsolete is something that we really need to rethink. It would be like saying, I have to get rid of my car because it's not passing an emissions test, and the emissions test is out of date, and it doesn't work. So that's what we're dealing with. So the saturated fat causes cholesterol to rise, which in turn causes heart disease, is a very failed hypothesis. You'll see why in a minute. So the question always comes up, if all of this that you say, Dr. Jonny, is correct, why does everybody think differently? How did we get it so wrong? Dr. Oz asked me that question when I was on his show, and I said, Dr. Oz, at one time the best scientists in the world all thought that the world was flat. Things change. So how did we get it wrong? It is interesting to look at this. Well, back in 1953, America had a president, the United States had a president named Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he was actually beloved. This was not as partisan a time as we live in right now. And actually, Democrats, Republicans, everybody admired this guy. He was a World War II hero. He was a very nice guy. He was a very likable guy. He looked fit. We didn't know at the time that smoking wasn't a habit that most fit people would engage in. But at the time, there were doctors doing cigarette commercials, and Ike was the embodiment of health and virtue. And he had a heart attack in office. And you got to understand, this is 1953, you have to understand that cardiology didn't even become a profession until the first half of the 20th century. So we did not know a lot about heart disease. We were not seeing it. And there was, generally speaking, a kind of national panic. Now, it wasn't quite like COVID, but it was like people were going, what's this heart disease? Is it going to happen to me? And how do I prevent it? And they wanted answers, and they wanted them quickly. So what happened? Well, there was a very pushy physiologist named Ancel Keys. He's taken a lot of beating in the low-carb media for the last 40 years for what he did then. But he had a hypothesis. Now, remember, he's not a nutritionist. Remember, he's not a medical doctor. His PhD was actually in eel physiology. But he had a tremendous reputation because he had invented the K rations, which were those little dried processed foods that keep you alive in a foxhole in World War II. So he had a lot of a reputation. And he staked that reputation on a theory. And the theory was his observation that in Italy, they didn't have as much heart disease, and it was probably because they didn't eat much fat. That was his observation, and he's sticking to it. And he presented data. He collected data from different countries showing that the less fat that they ate, the less heart disease that they had. And of course, that data was very suspect because he picked only 6 countries that actually proved his hypothesis, but there were 22 countries for whom, for which data was available, and he left out all the ones that didn't comport with his hypothesis. So all of the studies since then that have linked saturated fat with heart disease, or through the mechanism of raising cholesterol, have been what we call observational studies. In science, they call that epidemiology. We all know epidemiology now because we're in the middle of a pandemic and everybody is talking to the epidemiologists about how things spread. But you have to understand that in science, epidemiology is the redheaded stepsister. It's an observation. It's people looking at what people do. It's not a clinical study. And in fact, Reason Magazine recently put out an article called Epidemiology Makes Astrology Look Respectable. So basically, Ancel Keys observed correlations. But people who ate a lot of saturated fat were also wealthier. They also had more televisions. They also spent more time watching television. There were lots of confounding variables that weren't looked at. So I always like to give the audience some examples of statistically significant associations, like the one between saturated fat and heart disease, and so that you can actually see how much noise there is compared to actual signal. So here are some actual statistical significant associations that have held up over the years. Number 1, ice cream consumption correlates with the murder rate. Well, clearly eating ice cream causes murder, doesn't it? People who've seen the movie Crash are actually more likely to have blue eyes. This is what's called noise in statistics. They're statistically meaningful correlations, but they're not meaningful in the sense of mattering in any real life sense. There's certainly nothing to create a health policy around. There's a statistically significant correlation between the 8 years of the Clinton administration and the increase in diabetes. Now, whether you like Clinton or not, I don't think anybody is going to think that the Clintons caused diabetes. And there's a statistically significant inverse relationship between the number of pirates in the world and the temperature of the planet. So in other words, the more the pirates go down, the more the temperature goes up. So clearly, if we just get rid of pirates, we will have no more global warming. So you see the idiocy of some of these things. The one that I learned in statistics class that just kills me every time because it's so wonderful is that there is a statistically significant correlation in Denmark, in a certain part of Denmark, between storks and babies. Holds up year in and year out. You want to know the punchline, why it happens? Because in Denmark, when single people who live in the cities decide to marry and have kids, they move to the suburbs. And they have houses like this. And guess where storks like to nest? In houses like this, in thatched roofs that are angled. That is manna from heaven for if you're a stork. So yeah, the storks go to the suburbs, and the single people who get married and want to have babies go to the suburbs. And yes, the more storks, the more babies. Does one cause the other? Obviously not. And the same thing is true with saturated fat, ladies and gentlemen. Yet, because of these association studies, these observational studies, we wound up with a national fat phobia. And we wound up with this label on everything, and with eating low-fat mayonnaise and low-fat cottage cheese and all of this low-fat stuff that was supposed to be heart healthy, and as the research is showing now, was not, actually. The low-fat diet really worked well, right? The fat hangs lower every day. I had clients like this when I was a trainer at Equinox. The low-fat diet worked rarely. I don't want to say it never did. I want to say that it certainly wasn't the success everybody thought it was going to be. So how do we know these people were wrong? How do we know they were wrong about saturated fat and fat in general and heart disease? Well, we know because there's a lot of research showing that. Now, I want to spare you all of the scientific stuff, but just basically know every one of these studies basically shows no available science on the recommendations that the dietary committees have put forth for the last, since 1986. Here's a meta-analysis of saturated fat and cardiovascular diseases. No connection. Study questions fat and heart disease. Questionable link between saturated fat and heart disease. It's all over the place. So why don't doctors change their minds? Why? Why do they cling to this old information that demonizes healthy, natural saturated fats? Well, Upton Sinclair had it right. He's a famous American author, and he said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his job depends upon not understanding it." I don't know how many of you know Zoe Harcum. Very interesting story. She was a person without any degree, and she was one of these people who talks a lot about health and fitness in the women's magazines, and she kind of did a lot of motivational stuff. And one day she wrote about how starchy food, which is what everybody thought was the healthy thing, right? Because it's low fat and high carb. And she finds out through her considerable amount of experience and reading the research that that's not true. Well, the medical profession doesn't like that. They do not like that. Same thing happened to me. I'll tell you about it in a minute. So they attacked her mercilessly. You know what she did? She went back to school, she got a PhD in nutrition, and she had that nutrition thesis published in the British Medical Journal, and it says basically that evidence from the research does not support the dietary fat guidelines, and that was the headline that was shown everywhere. Zoe Harcum, PhD, finds no evidence in support of this ban on saturated fat and on fat in general. Same thing happened to me. I was a trainer at the Equinox Fitness Clubs, one of the most successful and biggest chains of health clubs in the world, in the country certainly. And in the 1990s, I was head of the Equinox Fitness Training Institute, and I taught this stuff, taught it to trainers, and I believed in low fat. And I believed that saturated fat and egg yolks and all of that stuff was going to kill you and give you a heart attack. And God, palm oil, the worst of all of them. Always believed all of that stuff. And it wasn't true. And as soon as I started questioning it, and I started when I in my teaching to say, guys, everything we've heard about this doesn't seem to really be true. There might be some nuance here. I think we're missing some of this stuff. The minute that happened, the medical profession started to attack me. Everybody attacked us. And who is that guy? He doesn't even have a degree. He's not a nutritionist. He's got a master's in psychology, but he's not a nutritionist. So I went back to school, got my PhD, wrote a book about saturated fat and cholesterol, and went up on Dr. Oz. And again, the medical profession, same thing. Why are you letting these quacks on? The other quack up there is Dr. Stephen Sinatra, a world-renowned cardiologist who was my partner in the book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, and was basically saying the same thing I was. So let's talk about the good things about palm oil. Now that we know that the whole saturated fat thing is really based on a house of cards, let's talk about why I think palm oil is as good as it is. I wrote about it in my book, The 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth. I actually gave it a star. as an outstanding food in an already, in a population of already outstanding foods. They didn't get into the book, The 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth, unless they were pretty good foods to begin with. And a few of them I gave special stars to for outstanding qualities. So what is it about palm oil? It's a couple things. I'm going to start with one. Tocotrienols. Tocotrienols are part of vitamin E. They're not the part that get all the attention, but they're the part that actually matters probably most. And you can get them as supplements. Now, why would you buy red palm tocotrienols, red palm oil, as a supplement? What does it do? What do these tocotrienols do that make it such a source of a health food supplement? I'll tell you what it does. It protects your brain. Tocotrienols protect your brain. And palm oil, as you can see, is one of the best sources of it. They even advertise that the tocotrienols are from red palm because it's such a strong source of tocotrienols. And tocotrienols protect the brain. Just Google it. And that's what comes up on the very first page. Tocotrienols protect brain against stroke in 3 different ways. And here's a research study in a peer-reviewed journal called Stroke, Clinical Investigation of the Protective Effects of Palm Vitamin E Tocotrienols on the Brain. Second way that palm oil is one of my favorite oils and is such a valuable oil to have is because it does not contribute to inflammation. And as I've written, I don't know how often and how many books I've mentioned it in, or how many articles I've mentioned it in, or how many lectures I've talked about it, but inflammation is at the heart of just about every degenerative disease you don't want to have. Every single one of them. Inflammation is a huge promoter of heart disease. It's a promoter of every disease that's in this little graphic that you see. And do you think that palm oil contributes to that? Well, let's look at what the 2 most pro-inflammatory foods are. In the American diet anyway, and probably in most industrial nations, 2 most pro-inflammatory foods. Number 1 is sugar, followed by vegetable oil. Yes, vegetable oil, the one that everyone has told you to substitute saturated fat for this wonderful vegetable oil, canola oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, all of them. Pro-inflammatory foods. They're actually called the hateful 8 in some circles. And what are they? They're all the things you were told to eat. And you don't see palm on that list, right? Canola, corn, cottonseed, sunflower, safflower, grapeseed, rice bran, soybean oil are all loaded with pro-inflammatory omega-6s. Palm oil isn't. It doesn't contribute to inflammation. And that alone makes it one of the most valuable oils to have in your kitchen. Now, I told you there's an amusing story about the one and only test I know that actually tested vegetable oil against saturated fat in a clinical research study. And it's fascinating and interesting. Around the time that Ancel Keys was doing all his observational studies that were proving that saturated fat was so bad for you and it caused heart disease, they did a study called the Minnesota Heart Study. And the Minnesota Heart Study was done in 7 different centers around the country. And like all the others, these studies were done by a team of people led by Ancel Keys who absolutely believed in the fat is bad theory, in the notion of reducing saturated fat as much as possible. This is the bad stuff. You don't want to have it. We should substitute all saturated fats with vegetable oils. We'll be so much more healthy. And of those 7 studies, one of them was supervised by a doctor named Dr. Ivan Franz. Now, Franz was a believer in this theory. He used to test his family for cholesterol once a week to see if they were eating too many egg yolks. I mean, he was very fanatic about it. He believed in it, but he also believed in science. And he thought to himself, we got all these observational studies. We all know they're not very good. I want to do my part of the Minnesota Heart Study right. I want to do a clinical double-blind randomized study. So he enrolled the aid of some local institutions. You couldn't do this now, but he got institutions where populations were fairly fixed for a couple of years, a prison, a hospital, a VA, various locations where more or less there was a fixed population and more or less you could control what they ate. And he basically did a double-blind experiment in which the food that the people got looked identical, the margarines, the butters, they were cut in the same shape, all that stuff. But one group had the normal amount of food with the normal amount of saturated fat, and the other had substituted the saturated fat for vegetable oil, even though the food looked identical. And they could control this because they controlled the cafeteria at these institutions, so they knew what people were eating, and they had people stay there for long enough time that they could get some really good data. So at the end of this study, Dr. Franz looks at his data, and he goes looking for a very clear benefit for vegetable oil, right? And the data are confusing. They don't show that clear benefit. And he's genuinely puzzled. He figures he did the study wrong. Because everybody knows, vegetable oil is definitely going to save lives if you switch from saturated fat to vegetable oil. So he was confused and he didn't know what to do. So he didn't publish it. And he put his data away, either in a basement or an attic. I'm not sure which version of the story you hear. But they were put away in storage and forgotten about. Okay, fast forward about 20 years. There's a researcher at the National Institute of Health named Christopher Ramsden. And he's thinking to himself as a thought exercise, he said, we have been recommending vegetable oil, since the 1980s. We've been telling this entire population to stop eating the natural fats that they have eaten all their lives, the saturated fat, the animal products, and to switch to this vegetable oil. And in the history of humankind, vegetable oil has never really taken up that many calories, that much space in a diet. Ramsden wanted to do a clinical test to see what happens when you substitute saturated fat for vegetable oil in a wholesale manner, the way we've told people to do in just about every industrial country in the world. And then he thought, I'll never get that study done. Who's going to fund that study? What can you do with that? Who's going to put the maybe $100 million that it would take to do that study properly in this time? And for what? If they can't patent a drug from the results, we would just be interested in learning. I guess it'll never get done. And then he has an aha moment and he says, holy moly, the study was done. That dude Franz, back in the Minnesota Heart Center story, he actually did this test. But he never published the results. If I could get my hand on those results, we would know a lot about what happens when you really substitute saturated fat for vegetable oil, right? So he looks up Franz's son. Franz's son is Dr. Robert Franz, who is now a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. And he says, will you help me find your dad's work? And Franz says, yeah, I'm sure. You want to look at it and reanalyze it or something? You're always confused my father. I will be glad to help you. Long story short, they spend 3 days digging around in the family house. They find the papers. Ramsden analyzes it. Some time passes. He calls up the young Dr. Franz, and he says, Dr. Franz, I understand why your dad was so puzzled by these results. They're very strange. And Franz says, yeah, what do you mean? He says, well, it's not just that there wasn't a clear advantage to vegetable oil. There was a clear disadvantage, especially if you were over 60. You died more. You had way more risk factors. And he said, I understand this was your dad's life work. And if I publish my findings, it will upend everything your father believed in. How do you feel about that? And the young guy said, publish it. My dad cared more about science than he did about being right. Does that get you? So they published it, and here's what Scientific American had to say about it. Records found in dusty basement undermine decades of dietary advice. So we were wrong about fat. I'm going to close with this wonderful study done by Dr. Sundram. And it is a cross-sectional study on dietary patterns. So they're not looking just at how much fat or how much protein or how much carbs or any given ingredient. They're looking at the pattern of how people eat. And what they basically did was they created a matrix. So they looked at the people who ate high fat with high carb, which would be the American diet. High fat, low carb, which would be the ideal American diet when we were all on that low fat kick. Low fat, low carb, that would be like a high protein diet or a low calorie diet. And low fat, high carb would be, the kind of aspirational diet of the low fat 70s and 80s. Okay. And he looked at those four. These are kind of examples. The American diet, keto diet would be high fat. Protein diet would be low fat and carb because it would be high in protein. And then the food pyramid would be your classic high carb, low fat. And he looked at those things, and what he found was that the amount of fat that you ate made virtually no difference to your risk factors. And 80% of his subjects were all consuming palm oil. That was the fat. The study was done in Malaysia. That's the fat that they eat. And so that's the olive oil of Asia. So it's 80% of the fat was that. So it couldn't have been that it was saturated, unsaturated. It was palm oil. And what they found was it didn't matter. Risk factors went up the higher you went on the carbohydrate scale, not the higher you went on the fat scale. So in conclusion, you've got a great food here. It suffers from a reputation of a lot of misinformation. I know you guys are working on correcting a lot of the information that has to do with production and impact. I'm here to help you correct the misinformation that has to do with nutrition and fat. And I hope I've disabused you of the notion that this is anything that you ever need to be afraid of. Palm oil is a wonderful oil. I use it in my kitchen. I recommend it on television. I'm a user. I'm a believer. And I hope that this has helped you to understand some of the benefits of palm oil. Thank you very much for being here.